For almost 18 months between the start of 2025 and June 2026, the war in Ukraine was arguably still in Russia's favor. Yes, it was slow, and at any given week, most of the news you get was a village taken here and a tree line taken there. After all, Russia slowed down significantly in how much territory it covered with each passing week. And yet, months of those slow advances added up, stack enough imperceptible gains on top of one another, and the line on the map starts to bend. That was the war. Russia pushed, Ukraine bled to slow it down, and the front crept to the west. Then something happened in March 2026. The net gains just stopped. And not stopped in the sense of slowing to a crawl, which we had seen before, but actually began reversing. Russia continued advancing in some sectors, but Ukraine more than clawed it back in others. The numbers, depending on which map you trust, tell a story that runs from a tentative few dozen square kilometers in Ukraine's favor in March to something well over 100 in April, to an even larger figure in May, to the point where we're mainly talking about how much Ukraine is pushing back. The first is obvious: the military itself. We're talking men, machines, fuel, ammunition, the physical capacity to keep throwing an army at a wall. The second is less obvious but just as important. The Kremlin is running out of believable stories. For 18 months, every setback had an explanation ready to go. The war was still on schedule, and Russia's economy, although falling short of optimistic projections, was still technically growing and managing to fuel the conflict despite the overwhelming sanctions. For most of 2025, Russia insisted that Ukraine kept losing more and more, even though it had negligible gains and needed to increasingly use up its reserves. What we're watching in 2026 is the moment when both material reserves and the propaganda start showing holes at the same time. The tank runs dry, and so does the excuse for why the tank is empty. Now, one main point to keep in mind is that all the data we have for early 2026 comes from various sources and might be skewed towards Ukraine. Public trackers don't agree on the magnitude, and on the narrowest readings, they barely agree on the direction. But Russia's entire method is nevertheless to push out and then rush reinforcements in to consolidate. If Ukraine is recovering the places Russia is trying to push into faster than Russia can reinforce them, then the Russian offensive is failing on its own terms. It doesn't matter how the controlled ground is actually referred to by Russian media. The offensive is not achieving its objective, and the side that was supposed to be defending is the side setting the tempo. Back in March, you could squint and call that seasonal. By the time you get to May's figures, the seasonal story has run out of road, which conveniently is exactly where we start. Factor 1 is the weather. Moisture, rain, snow, melting ice can be deadly for moving heavy vehicles, and even in a war defined by drones and tiny infiltration teams, armored vehicles still matter, and everyone, drone operator or not, has to be resupplied. This past winter was colder and wetter than the year before, which meant a lot more snow. By March, that snow melted, and it set up a genuinely brutal mud season that turns Ukrainian and Russian dirt roads into something closer to soup, so the offensive bogged down. Russia's winning play here was to blame the weather. Nobody made a bad decision, they argue. The ground just got soft, regardless of the fact that it was Russia that arguably set the tempo for advances for the past year. But then we have to look at the inconsistencies. The mud theory suggests a frozen, stalled front rather than Ukraine advancing. If this were the whole story, you'd expect both armies to be stuck in place, cursing the weather equally. After all, both countries technically had decades of training on similar terrain, as the climate near Ukraine and Russia's southwestern regions is practically the same. So the weather is real, and it helps stall Russia's pace. But it's the first example of a pattern you can see over and over, with a comfortable Kremlin-friendly explanation that accounts for why Russia stopped, but conspicuously fails to account for why Russia is now losing ground. Factor 2 is the tree line, genuinely one of the most beautiful sights in the country. Endless golden fields under enormous blue sky. It's pretty much the inspiration for the Ukrainian flag, and showcases Ukraine's role as a major wheat and grain producer and exporter. But look at the edges of those fields, and you'll find rows of trees. The technical term is a windbreak. These exist because without them, the wind strips the topsoil and Ukraine stops being the breadbasket of Europe. Those same windbreaks make excellent cover for advancing infantry trying to hide from the drones overhead. In a way, that soil conservation program from the 1930s has actually been helping Russian assault groups creep forward unseen. But even in 2024, Ukraine started using fire, equipping drones with makeshift flamethrowers to burn the windbreaks and expose Russian positions. While the scale of Ukraine's efforts to remove cover in 2026 is unclear, any scale of it could be enough to remove one of Russia's few advantages when moving between highly populated places. And even here, there's an element where the Russian stall doesn't make sense. Burned tree lines should choke off the flow of Russian infantry, but they'd also make it harder for Ukraine to advance through the same ground because cover cuts both ways. Which brings us to factor 3, the one where the tempo actually shifted. Internet connectivity and Starlink. Now, Russian troops actually ran their frontline communications on smuggled and captured Starlink terminals, which is the same satellite internet that kept Ukraine connected since 2022. Russia was never supposed to have them since SpaceX won't sell in Russia. But in early February 2026, that ended. Following talks between Elon Musk and Ukraine's newly appointed defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, SpaceX moved to kill unauthorized Russian access. Ukraine submitted a whitelist of its own terminals, while everything else in the occupied zones went dark. Musk, in his characteristic way, posted that the steps taken to stop Russia's unauthorized use appeared to have worked and publicly asked if more was needed. The effect was immediate, and this is where the propaganda thread gets sharp. Ukrainian officials reported assaults grinding to a halt almost overnight, and the Center for European Policy Analysis argued it could collapse Russia's entire military communications. And the Pentagon itself later assessed that Ukraine retook roughly 400 square kilometers after those terminals were deactivated, marking Kyiv's first real gain since 2023. Now hold that against the official Kremlin line, which for months had been that Russian soldiers never used Starlink or had access to the network. That claim was never quite credible, and the instant the terminals died and the assault stalled, it became impossible. You can't simultaneously insist your army doesn't depend on a thing and then visibly seize up the moment that thing is taken away. And the cleanup story is almost worse for Moscow than the original problem. Russia's answer is a homegrown satellite network called Rassvet, meaning dawn. According to early reports, it should go commercial by 2027. But the trouble is the arithmetic. Analysts say a constellation like that needs at least 250 satellites to function as a reliable network. By June 2026, Rassvet had 16 in orbit and even lost one of them, and the program is already behind its own schedule. SpaceX, for comparison, operates well over 10,000 satellites. So the reassurance from the Kremlin that the replacement is coming only gives a 2027 timeline. That means frontline troops are looking at command and control problems stretching into 2027, and even that's an optimistic projection. Factor 4 lands at almost the same moment, and it's a double blow that Russia remarkably dealt to itself. Telegram. Around the time the Starlink terminals went dark, the Kremlin's internet censor, Roskomnadzor, moved to throttle Telegram's functionality. This was a political decision, not a military one. Telegram is where Russians share grievances, where dissatisfaction spreads, and even where protesters could organize. Throttling is a way for the state to manage the story by managing the platform. There was just one small problem, as Russian troops also ran their coordination on Telegram. So in the same window that the invading army lost its internet, it also lost the platform many troops relied upon for communication. Instead, Russia peddled its government-supported alternative called Max. But while it was initially promoted in late summer of 2025, by 2026, the app was flagged to contain severe security issues. This prompted the government to change course and again recommend Telegram for frontline troops. But in June 2026, there's still no consensus on which app the troops are meant to use for communication. All the while, Starlink doesn't work and its replacement is still not ready. This is where exhausting the troops and the narrative stop being parallel lines and start feeding each other. The worse the battlefield looks, the more dissatisfaction builds among ordinary Russians. The more dissatisfaction builds, the greater the Kremlin's incentive to clamp down on the platforms where that dissatisfaction lives. But clamping down on those platforms degrades the army's own communications, which makes the battlefield look worse, which generates more dissatisfaction. Factor 5 is where things get genuinely interesting, because it suggests something deeper than a run of good luck. Railway strikes. For this, we need to step back from the front for a second. The entire theory of how you beat Russia has centered not on the trench line, but on the supply line. Whatever is happening at the literal front is irrelevant if the troops there can't get fuel, shells, and food. In fact, Russian gains at the front make the supply problem worse, because now you have to push provisions even further forward. So you just have to starve the army and let the front collapse on its own. Ukraine's ability to apply that strategy has historically been limited. Projecting destructive power dozens of kilometers behind the line is historically the privilege of great powers, not of the country being invaded. Ukraine has landed opportunistic deep hits for 4 years, sure, but those were one-offs rather than a sustained campaign. This might no longer be true, and that's the real story here. The tempo of strikes on railways, junctions, and logistics nodes has climbed sharply over recent months. How Ukraine pulled this off is not fully clear, and the honest answer is drones with a lot of unknowns underneath it. One credible guess is that Ukraine eroded Russia's edge in fiber-optic drones, the jam-proof wire-guided kind that had let Russia dominate the deep grey zone, and that reversing that edge let Ukrainian systems reach much further into Russian-held territory. Regardless of the models being used, and a new one seems to pop out weekly, Ukraine has found a way to push destruction deep behind the line on a sustained basis, and that's starting to register at the front. Crucially, this is also a category the Kremlin can't easily narrate away, because a severed rail line is not something you can hide when the trains that are supposed to be using them simply aren't running. Factor 6 is the natural extension of that logic, culminating in longer-range strikes on Russia's military-industrial base. The barrier here has always been that weapons plants sit far from the front, in hardened buildings behind air defense. To hit them, you need something that flies a long way, carries a real payload, and survives the trip. Two things changed. One, Russian air defenses have been visibly crumbling for the better part of a year, and two, Ukraine managed to create a bird that could fly far enough to crush them completely. The bird is the Flamingo, or FP5, built by the Ukrainian company Firepoint, which earned its name from the flamingo pink finish on its first rollout. According to reports, it's not a tweaked drone, it's a heavy cruise missile, reportedly carrying something in the range of a 1,150-kilogram warhead out to roughly 3,000 kilometers. This is an order of magnitude more explosive than the long-range drones and mini-cruise missiles Ukraine had been making do with, which often carried only tens of kilograms. Confirmed Flamingo strikes already include targets like the Votkinsk machine-building plant and major arsenals belonging to Russia's main missile and artillery directorate. In other words, exactly the deep hardened factory and magazine targets that were off the menu a year ago. What's more difficult to pin down is the precise damage and effect on Russia's production, and here the propaganda problem flips in the Kremlin's favor for once. A struck factory doesn't produce the dramatic fireball that makes neighbors film it and post it, so battle damage assessment is genuinely harder. Now, if you want to learn more about Ukraine's drones, like the FP5, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show. We post daily videos on new developments and every new drone model Ukraine showcases. But Factor 7 does tend to produce a lot of fire and mayhem. We're talking about Russia's oil industry, more specifically exports, and this is the one where the narrative is most in Ukraine's favor. As a reminder, this war has become the single largest financial undertaking of the Russian state since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Between 2022 and 2026, Russia has consistently had record-breaking military budgets, soaring to 40% of all government spending, and that was only for the publicly admitted funding. So, it can be argued that if Russia loses its income and the ability to pay soldiers and build shells, it could basically forfeit the war without outright losing it. And strikes on oil refineries, export ports, and the Shadow Fleet tankers attack that income directly. And because Russian air defenses are in such poor shape, the campaign has been working for months and is only getting worse for Moscow. In April 2026, Ukraine hit Russian oil infrastructure at least 21 times, and the Russian refinery throughput fell to the lowest level since December 2009. This was a 16-year low driven by drones. So here's what the propaganda apparatus did with that. Faced with falling fuel output, Moscow simply stopped publishing the fuel output figures in 2024. Removed the data, removed the story. Except the drop was large enough that Rostat's own broader index registered it anyway. as oil products output went down more than 9% year-on-year in a single month. And then come the export bans, Russia banning gasoline exports, then jet fuel exports, ostensibly to protect domestic supply. Read that carefully. An export ban to guarantee your own population has fuel is a quiet confession of exactly the shortage the official line denies. In ordinary times, you don't ration what you have plenty of and can actively produce. And the oil slide bleeds directly into Factor 8, because the money buys the men. With less revenue, the Kremlin has been forced to scale back recruitment, and recruitment is the other half of the equation that decides this war. Independent analysis built on Russia's own finance ministry and regional budget data indicates recruitment fell roughly 20% in the first quarter of this year compared to the same period last year, to something on the order of 70,000 new contract soldiers. But Russian officials, including the defense minister, have publicly claimed recruitment is running ahead of plan. And over the same stretch, regions across Russia have been quietly increasing their sign-on bonuses to record highs, averaging around 1.5 million rubles, about $21,000. If recruitment were genuinely ahead of plan, you wouldn't need to keep raising the price. The bonus is the truth that the press release will not say out loud. The official story climbs, while the incentive structure underneath it screams the opposite. Now stack that against losses, and here we're going to hedge hard, because the casualty figures originate overwhelmingly with Ukrainian and Ukrainian-aligned sources and should be treated as claims rather than confirmed facts. With reported losses of upwards of 1.3 million casualties by early 2026, Russia is losing soldiers faster it can sign new ones. For February 2026, the losses were estimated at 40,000 soldiers, while recruitment was estimated to be only 35,000. This is a 12.5% deficit, way more than what should be considered sustainable for a country that's suggesting it's winning the war. Even setting aside the specific numbers, the underlying logic is that the attacking army needs significantly more manpower than a defending one. And when going through manpower numbers, Russia actually started with only 190,000 deployed troops in Ukraine. By 2025, Russia had around 600,000 troops deployed, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And even here, there's a major discrepancy considering that Zelensky suggested Ukraine had 880,000 deployed troops. So even in early 2025, Russia ostensibly lost the manpower lead it had, and even that isn't counting the disparity in technological development and access. But throughout 2025, Russia lost more troops than it recruited. Most consistent estimates suggest 415,000 lost troops against a recruiting benchmark of 409,000. While that's a fairly insignificant loss, it cuts through any notion that Russia is actually amassing more troops against Ukraine and winning the broader conflict. And the most impressive gains by Ukraine are more easily explained by genuine control of the skies, including the drone supremacy, deep strike, and the comms collapse factors. This is even better for Ukraine, since the Kremlin's narrative for the past 4 years is that there's nothing to worry about on the front and that the Russian population won't feel the effects of the special military operation. But if Ukraine has managed to achieve a semblance of air supremacy while also having a more numerous force in the country, it means that Russia is arguably failing on both fronts. Now, where does this actually go? While the figures for May are not impressive, at only around 220 square kilometers reacquired by Ukraine, the scale and context are key here. In September 2022, during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukraine took back something on the order of 6,000 square kilometers in a matter of weeks. Even the summer of 2023 counteroffensive, now remembered as a disappointment, netted around 377 square kilometers in June and 257 in July, before collapsing to under 2 square kilometers by September. But what the offensive has bought Ukraine is time. The first benefit is straightforward. If Russia regains the initiative, it will find the going much harder than before. But there's a subtler, more interesting benefit. A strong defensive backstop is an insurance policy, and insurance changes behavior. It lets Ukraine take risks on offense that it otherwise couldn't, because the downside of an attack going badly is no longer catastrophic. This, in fact, was one of the quiet reasons the 2023 offensive sputtered. Kyiv never fully committed because there wasn't much of a net beneath if it failed. And there is a final consequence worth considering, which concerns the negotiating table. Sustained Ukrainian success can shrink the bargaining gap that has kept this war grinding on. Russia can't credibly demand the rest of the Donbass if there's no plausible military path for Russia to take the rest of the Donbass in the field. That, in turn, makes it unlikely that Ukraine's concession of the Donbass would simply allow Russia to regroup and continue the conflict within a few years. But ultimately, Ukraine doesn't need to fully recover all of its territory, as Russia is slowly collapsing from the inside. And if that continues, it might not be able to sustain this war for much longer. The grind in 2025 and the breaking of the offensive in mid-2026 just means that the internal collapse is much more imminent. To learn more, check out this video. And as always, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show for the news updates on global geopolitics.